Chapter 1 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Chapter 1. Salamis, B.C. 480. The world has lost all record of the greatest of its inventors. The pioneers who, in far-off ages, devised the simple appliances with which men till the ground, did their domestic work, and fought their battles for thousands of years. He who hung up the first weaver's beam and shaped the first rude shuttle was a more wonderful inventor than Arkwright. The maker of the first bow and arrow was a more enterprising pioneer than our inventors of machine guns. And greater than the builders of dreadnoughts were those who, with hearts girt round with oak and triple brass, were the first to trust their frail barks to the cruel sea. No doubt the hollowed tree trunk and the coracle of osiers and skins had long before this made their trial trips on rivers and lakes. Then came the first ventures in the shallow sea margins, and, at last, a primitive naval architect built up plank bulwarks round his hollowed tree trunk, and stiffened them with ribs of bent branches, and the first ship was launched. This evolution of the ship must have been in progress independently in more places than one. We're most concerned here with its development in that eastern end of the landlocked Mediterranean, which is the meeting place of so many races, and around which so much of what is most momentous in the world's history has happened. There seems good reason for believing that among the pioneers in early naval construction were the men of that marvelous people of old Egypt, to whom the world's civilization owes so much. They had doubtless learned their work on their own Nile before they pushed out by the channels of the delta to the waters of the Great Sea. They had invented the sail, though it was centuries before anyone learned to do more than scud before the wind. It took long experience of the sea to discover that one could fix one's sail at an oblique angle with the midline of the ship, to lay a course with the wind on the quarter or even abeam and not dead astern. But there was as important an invention as the sail, that of the oar. We are so familiar with it that we do not realize all it means. Yet it is a notable fact that whole races of men who navigate river, lake, and sea successfully and boldly never hit upon the principle of the oar till they were taught it by Europeans, and could of themselves get no further than the paddle. The oar, with its leverage, its capacity for making the very weight of the crew become a motive power, became in more senses than one the great instrument of progress on the sea. It gave the ship a power of maneuvering independently of the wind, the same power that is the essence of advantage in steam propulsion. The centuries during which the sailing ship was the chief reliance of navigation and commerce were, after all, an episode between the long ages when the oar-driven galley was the typical ship and the present age of steam beginning less than 100 years ago. Sails were an occasional help to the early navigator. Our songs of the sea call them the white wings of the ship. For the Greek poet Aeschylus, the wings of the ship were the long oars. The trader creeping along the coast, or working from island to island, helping himself when the wind served with the sail, and having only a small crew, could not afford much oar power, though he had often to trust it. But for the fighting ship, oar power and speed were as important as mechanical horsepower is for the warships of the 20th century. So the war galley was built longer than the trader, to make room for as many oars as possible on either side. In the Mediterranean in those early days, as with the Vikings of later centuries, the long ship meant the ship of war. It is strange to reflect that all through human history, war has been a greater incentive to shipbuilding progress than peaceful commerce. For those early navigators, the prizes to be won by fighting and raiding were greater than any that the more prosaic paths of trade could offer. The fleets that issued from the delta of the Nile were piratical squadrons that were the terrors of the Mediterranean coasts. The Greek, too, like the Norseman, began his career on the sea with piracy. The Athenian historian tells of days when it was no offense to ask a seafaring man, "Are you a pirate, sir?" The first admirals of the eastern Mediterranean had undoubtedly more likeness to Captain Kidd and Blackbeard than to Nelson and Collingwood. Later came the time when organized governments in the Greek cities and on the Phoenician coast kept fleets on the landlocked sea to deal with piracy and protect peaceful commerce. But the prizes that allured the corsair were so tempting that piracy revived again and again, and even in the late days of the Roman Republic the Consul Pompey had to conduct a maritime war on a large scale to clear the sea of the pirates. Of the early naval wars of the Mediterranean, battles of more or less piratical fleets, or of the war galleys of coast and island states, we have no clear record, or no vestige of a record. Egyptians, Phoenicians, Cretans, men of the rich island state of which we have only recently found the remains in buried palaces, Greeks of the Asiatic mainland and their eastern neighbours, Greeks of the islands and the peninsula, Illyrians of the labyrinth of creek and island that fringes the Adriatic, Sicilians and Carthaginians, all had their adventures and battles on the sea in the dim beginnings of history. Homer has his catalogue of ships set forth in stately verse, telling how the Greek chieftains led 120,000 warriors, embarked on 1,100 galleys, to the siege of Troy. But no hostile fleet met them, if indeed the great armament ever sailed, as to which historians and critics dispute. One must pass on for centuries after Homer's day to find reliable and detailed records of early naval war. The first great battle on the sea, of which we can tell the story, was the fight in the Straits of Salamis, when Greek and Persian strove for the mastery of the Near East. King Darius had found that his hold on the Greek cities of Asia Minor was insecure so long as they could look for armed help to their kindred beyond the archipelago, and he had sent his satraps to raid the Greek mainland. That first invasion ended disastrously at Marathon. His son Xerxes took up the quarrel, and devoted years to the preparation, not of a raid upon Europe, but of an invasion in which the whole power of his vast empire was to be put forth by sea and land. It was fortunate for Greece that the man who then counted for most in the politics of Athens was one who recognized the all-importance of sea power, though it is likely that at the outset all he had in mind was that the possession of an efficient fleet would enable his city to exert its influence on the islands and among the coast cities, to the exclusion of the military power of its rival Sparta. When it was proposed that the product of the silver mines of Laurium should be distributed among the Athenian citizens, it was Themistocles who persuaded his fellow countrymen that a better investment for the public wealth would be found in the building and equipment of a fleet. He used as one of his arguments the probability that the Persian king would, sooner or later, try to avenge the defeat of Marathon. A no less effective argument was the necessity of protecting their growing commerce. Athens looked upon the sea, and that sea at once divided and united the scattered Greek communities who lived on the coasts and islands of the archipelago. It was the possession of the fleet thus acquired that enabled Themistocles and Athens to play a decisive part in the crisis of the struggle with Asia. It was in the spring of B.C. 480 that the march from Asia Minor began. The vast multitude gathered from every land in western Asia, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, and the wild mountain plateaus of the Indian border, was too numerous to be transported in any fleet that even the great king could assemble. For 7 days and nights it poured across the floating bridge that swayed with the current of the Dardanelles, a bridge that was a wonder of early military engineering, and the making of which would tax the resources of the best army of today. It then marched by the coastline through what is now Rumelia and Thessaly. It ate up the supplies of the lands through which it passed. If it was to escape famine, it must keep in touch with the ships that crossed and recrossed the narrow seas, bringing heavy cargoes of food and forage from the ports of Asia, and escorted by squadrons of long war galleys. Every Greek city had been warned of the impending danger. Even those who remembered Marathon, the day when a few thousand spearmen had routed an Asiatic horde outnumbering them tenfold, realized that any force that now could be put in the field would be overwhelmed by this human tide of 1,000,000 fighting men. But there was one soldier statesman who saw the way to safety, and grasped the central fact of the situation. This was Themistocles the Athenian, the chief man of that city, against which the first fury of the attack would be directed. No doubt it was he who inspired the prophetess of Delphi with her mysterious message that the Athenians must make for themselves wooden walls, and he supplied the explanation of the